Welcome, everybody, to another WeCanReason Webinar. Everyone is welcome. As you all know, these are free. However, if you can, please donate to us because we have some expenses and it always helps us. When you donate, so just go to our website, rockymounthatheists.ca, and click the donate button. Any amount that you can donate is welcome.
By the way, you're coming through rather faintly. I checked that my speaker was on reasonably loud.
My audio is too low. Is that it?
A bit better.
Okay, so now I just force the mic here. Before we start, a few messages. Okay, so we are a community of atheists, humanists, and skeptics, and we welcome anyone. We have never had any disruption from our attendees. Please let's keep this record clean. Okay, discussion is encouraged as long as everyone shows respect for one another. At the end of the presentation, we have our Q&A. Okay, so just wait to ask any questions, and then you just raise your hand using the option at the bottom of the Zoom app. Okay, and then you just wait to be called to ask your questions. And just quick disclaimer, the views and opinions expressed by speakers and audience members during this event are their own and do not reflect official policies, positions, or views of Rocky Mountain Atheists. So now, with no further delay, we introduce you to Leslie Rosenblood from CFI Canada. He's also the podcast chair, and he will be talking to us about the history of secularism in Canada, where we were, where we are, and where we should be. So, Leslie, if you want to take control, I'll just stop sharing here.
Yep, just.
Mike, stop sharing. It's not stopping.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Okay, now we.
I'm trying to. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Oh, let me. Okay, can everyone see the screen? It should just be the title of my presentation. Everyone can see that? Wonderful. Well, then thank you, Helios, and thank you, Rocky Mountain Atheists, for hosting me this evening. And I'm going to be talking to you about secularism and giving you a history of where we were and where we are. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a diehard secularist, and I devote a great deal of my non-sleeping, non-parenting, and non-working hours to secularism in Canada. And I really focus this through in two areas, and I do that through two organizations. One, which we've already mentioned, is the Centre for Inquiry Canada. And that's what I strive to do to create cultural change. I think of this as on the retail level. This is changing the hearts and minds of individuals. CFIC, if you're not aware of it, is a national educational charity that supports and promotes reason, compassion, and secular values. And so there's the podcast for Inquiry. I'm the host of that. It's been going on for about 3 years. You get it wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube if you like watching videos of people talking. And we really are just looking to educate people about a number of things. Secularism is one of the pillars of the organizations. There's several others as well. And the other organization that I've contributed a lot of my time and effort to is called the Canadian Secular Alliance. And that's really on the public policy side of things. So regulations, how government operates, what the laws are. It's a nonprofit think tank, and it advances church-state separation and government neutrality. And I'll be talking about both organizations as we proceed throughout today. But before I go any further, I think it's really important that we understand what is secularism, that we have a definition that we're all using when we talk about it, and it's the same one, because this is a word, if you look it up in the dictionary, with several definitions. So at the highest level, I want to make it clear that I'm talking about the political philosophy of secularism. It's also a sociological term. So we can talk about, the secular versus the ecclesiastical, or if a society is becoming more secular, sometimes or quite often it means that church attendance, for example, is going down, or that people are checking off none, the rise of the nuns. So that's evidence of a society becoming more secular. That's fine, and that's a fine use of the word secularism, or the word secular, but that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about political secularism. So when I say secularism today, I'm talking about the principle of government neutrality in matters of religion. So, put another way, government should not favor one religion over another, or religious belief over non-belief, or favoring non-believers over believers. When it comes to religion, just government is neutral. It doesn't partake in the debate. You can think of it as the government should neither support nor suppress religious expression among the populace. And this is the definition of secularism that both the Centre for Inquiry Canada and the Canadian Secular Alliance use. So secularism is not complete church-state separation. So what I mean by that is that a secular state should have Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Muslims and Wiccans and atheists as part of the government, working for the government, enforcing public policy, and creating it. It's more of a mosaic approach. So we're not trying to exclude the religious or the devout atheist from it. It's also, as I mentioned before, the sociological secularism. It's not about a reduction of religious belief or practice in society. And as I said, both of those are perfectly valid uses of the word secularism. I just want to make it clear that that's not what I'm talking about tonight. It's also not about anti-religious bias. Saying that someone is secular does not mean that person hates someone, all people of faith or people of a particular faith. That's a common use of the word, or sorry, a common interpretation of the word, but that one is wholly inaccurate. So let's look at secularism in practice, how it actually is day to day. Now, in practice, Canadians like to keep politics and religion separate. There's more concern in Canada if a politician or a wannabe politician is too religious. That's more of a detriment than if someone is insufficiently observant. And so that's why sometimes we might hear that a politician might have a hidden agenda, or they might be a closet creationist. Um, um, and we don't really have any laws in the last few decades that have an explicitly religious justification, though there are plenty on the books, and I'll get into some of them, that we either inherited at our inception or that were made in the early years of Canada. So broadly speaking, laws, regulations, policies, these are all grounded with rational, objective justifications, even if they are inspired by faith. So Tommy Douglas, for example, a Methodist minister, he claims he was inspired by his faith to create Medicare, and I think that he's being honest about that. But when he argued why we should have it, he didn't. He didn't say we have to do it because God commanded or because it's my faith. He said we need to take care of each other. He used secular arguments, and they carried the day. Now, let's contrast that to our neighbors to the south. Uh, Religion and faith play an enormous role in politics. Just about every speech from every politician ends with the phrase, God bless America. Um, when the first Catholic president was elected, Kennedy, back in the 60s, there was a big concern whether the United States was ready for a Catholic president. And the reason for that was, who is the president going to be loyal to? The United States of America or the Pope? Uh, we saw a small redux of that when Romney was the Republican nominee a few years ago. There was some conversation about whether America was ready for a Mormon president, but that was fairly muted, and really, it didn't. I don't think that had much of an effect on the election. And when the United States elected its second Catholic president, Joe Biden, I mean, you may love him, you may hate him, whatever you think of him. The fact that he was Catholic really didn't enter into the discussion at all, either during the election or during his presidency. But unfortunately, religion does play a fairly large role in the United States. Just a couple of years ago, hundreds, millions of women lost their bodily autonomy when Roe v. Wade was struck down, and women in many states no longer have access to safe abortions, no matter what rationale might be available to them. The Catholic tenet that life begins at conception, which is a religious precept with no scientific foundation whatsoever, was crucial in the argument that struck down Roe v. Wade. On a practical basis as well, it's nearly impossible for an open atheist to be elected in the United States. And in fact, 7 state constitutions ban atheists from public office. Now, those are still on the books. Those are what are referred to as zombie laws. Those atheist clauses, the clauses that ban atheists from running for public office or holding public office, even if you are appointed to it, those are not enforceable because of a 1961 Supreme Court ruling. But nonetheless, those are still on the books for 7 states in the U.S. But let's look at secularism in theory. If we were to look at the United States on paper, we'll look at its laws, look at its right a bit without an understanding of the cultural elements that I just went through. The United States looks great. Article 6 of the Constitution reads in part that no religious test shall ever be required as the qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. That's really clear. The very famous First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States reads, in part, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof. I mean, that is an excellent expression of secular principles. So it's very interesting to see just how far the practice of politics in the United States diverges from the formal text of its founding documents. How secular is Canada on this basis? Not really. So in the preamble of the Constitution, we cherish the supremacy of God, and I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes. We have God Keep Our Land Glorious and Free in our national anthem. And 3 provinces, that would be Ontario, where I am, Alberta, where I assume most of you are, and Saskatchewan, still have publicly funded Catholic school systems. So all of that is today. I want to take you back to the founding of Canada and how secular were we back when we were a young country. And the short answer is not at all. Canada, at its inception, we espoused a toxic blend of racism and religious bigotry. Only white, male Christians were considered real Canadians. When we were building our national building project was the railway, and we imported a lot of Chinese workers to do that. It was a very backbreaking labor, very dangerous. The Chinese workers on the National Railway got half of the wages of their white counterparts. They were also considered dispensable. So they were given all of the most dangerous tasks, and the injury and death rates for Chinese nationals who were working on the railway compared to their white counterparts was much, much higher. We inherited a lot of our Christian laws and institutions from England and France, and a lot of those are still with us today. Also, that then we brought in so many people to work on the railways that we felt that there were just too many Chinese people in Canada. So we passed the Chinese Immigration Act in 1885 that demanded that Chinese pay $50, which was increased 10 times in about 18 years later in 1903 to $500 just to come into the country. And just to give you a sense of how much $500, that's 2 years' salary for an average wage. That didn't work. There were still too many people, too many Chinese people coming into Canada. So we passed what was then called the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, but today we call it the Chinese Exclusion Act. And just in case you think that it might be a cultural or linguistic barrier, it wasn't. This applied not just to Chinese nationals, but also to British citizens of Chinese ancestry. So it was quite explicitly a racist law. And part of the reason for that is that we considered that really only Western values, that morality and Christian values were synonymous. That was the perspective of Canada and our leaders at the time. And we could see that right from the even before Canada became a country, due to our horrific treatment of Indigenous peoples in many ways through our residential schools. And the explicit the explicit purpose of our residential schools was to make the Indigenous peoples of Canada embrace Western values and Christianity. The goal was to civilize the savage through Christianization. And this horrific government policy was enthusiastically executed by various Christian churches in Canada. And then more recently, in the 1940s and 1950s, we had what were known as the children of sin, or the Duplessis orphans. And these were children that were born to unwed mothers, born out of wedlock. They were forcibly sent to Catholic orphanages, even if there was both a mother and father, but they were removed from their parents forcibly 3 days after birth. And then these Catholic orphanages decided to reclassify themselves. They weren't going to be orphanages anymore. They were psychiatric hospitals. Why? Because as orphanages, they got a certain stipend, a daily stipend from the government to clothe and feed and take care of these children. But if they were classified as a psychiatric hospital, that daily stipend was doubled. So that was basically just corruption, and these children, as you might suspect, were terribly abused. Decades later, in 2006, the Quebec government offered $26 million in compensation for the survivors of those that made it through these orphanages. But in order to get any of that money, they had to sign a waiver. And one of the conditions of the waiver was that they would take no legal action against the Catholic Church. So the Quebec government funded the Catholic Church through these orphanages and then protected it once when it was all over. So that's so I know that we often like to think of ourselves as wonderful, but it's important to be clear-eyed about where we came from and the origins of our country. Now, we got what is now our Constitution. The highest law of the land is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And as far as that goes, that's fairly recent. It was only in 1982 that the Charter was ratified. And it says right there in the preamble of the Charter, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And anyone with a logical mind can immediately find a flaw in this. And because supremacy means one thing, only one thing can be supreme. So which is it? What is supreme, God or the rule of law? That's not at all clear based on the wording of the preamble of our charter. Furthermore, in the second section, it's contradicted. So the second section says that everybody has freedom of conscience and religion. Well, if there's the supremacy of God, what about the various faiths that have multiple deities? What about those that don't believe in any deities? And declaring the supremacy of God is not consistent with freedom of thought and freedom of belief. So it was in the preamble. Even Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was the prime minister at the time when the charter was signed, there's a couple of quotations that I'd like to share with you. He said that it is strange, so long after the Middle Ages, that some politicians felt obliged to mention God in the Constitution, which is, after all, a secular and not a spiritual document. So even our prime minister thought it was fairly ridiculous, but some premiers needed to have that in there in order to sign, and so he let that in. Later on, he also said, and what I can only imagine is a fit of pique. I don't think God gives a damn whether he's in the Constitution or not. So those are fairly strong words from our former prime minister. And although the preamble of the charter is symbolically significant, several Supreme Court rulings since 1982 give it very little legal weight. So high in symbolism, but light in practical application. And so, speaking of the Supreme Court of Canada, I want to take you through, I think, 3 different rulings over the last few decades that indicate milestones in Canada's journey to becoming increasingly secular over time. And the first one is from about 4 decades ago, 1985. Ontario had a no Sunday shopping law. And and then the company opened on Sunday, and so they were charged and they were brought to court. And the government wanted to defend its Sunday shopping law, or its law banning shopping on Sundays. And so they said, but we just want a day of rest. It's not fair, particularly to the poor small business owners, for them to work all day, every day. Everybody should have at least one day off a week. And so they were asked, okay, well, what if the business is run by a Jewish family? And the Jewish Sabbath is a Saturday, not on Sunday. So they close on Saturdays. If they close their business on Saturdays, can they open on Sundays? And the government responded no, because the law mandated that all shops had to be closed on Sunday. Also, the court noticed that it was the name of the law, the name of the law that banned Sunday shopping was called the Lord's Day Act. So the justification for it was not a secular purpose of giving people a day of rest. It was a religious purpose to respect the Lord, and so that people wouldn't have to work and they could go on Sundays and they could go to church. So the law was struck down. And the court found that the law was designed to protect one religion, and on that basis, it was not legal. And this was a big deal. This was only 3 years after the charter was signed. So this was one of the first major religious cases. Now, the Supreme Court did leave open the door to having legislation that proclaimed a day of rest. It's not against that principle. But for various reasons, various provinces have tried to legislate a day of rest or one day closed in the decades since. But for various reasons that I just, for the sake of time, don't want to get into, they've all failed or have been abandoned. But one quotation from the ruling, for the first time, the Supreme Court said that non-belief is equally protected under religious freedom. And that was a major milestone for non-believers in Canada, because that had not been explicitly stated until that point. Now, fast forward about 30 years, and there's the city of Saguenay in Quebec, and before every meeting in the chambers, the mayor would lead everybody present in prayer, and it was always a Christian prayer, usually an explicitly Catholic one. And there was one member, one citizen of Saguenay, and he attended, and he was an atheist, and he felt very uncomfortable. And so the mayor said that if he was uncomfortable when everyone else was praying, he could wait outside. And then when they were finished praying, he could come back in and watch and watch the meeting. He sued. He went all the way up to it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Canadian Secular Alliance, which is one of the organizations I volunteer for, was an intervener in this case. So that basically means that we're not directly involved, we're not harmed, but we have something of value to say. And the Supreme Court agreed, so we got to make our arguments in front of the Supreme Court, as well as all the people that were directly involved in the lawsuit. And the ruling came out that uh, essentially bans municipalities from engaging in public prayer. Now, that doesn't apply to the House of Commons federally or to provincial legislatures. The scope of the ruling, that falls under different legislation. But municipalities are not allowed anymore to pray or to open meetings with a prayer. And the government said that it was a breach of its duty of neutrality. And I think it's worthwhile to quote Gascon, one of the Supreme Court justices. He wrote in the ruling that sponsorship of one religious tradition by the state in breach of its duty of neutrality amounts to discrimination against all other such traditions, which is really good verbiage to have in a Supreme Court ruling. He also wrote, in short, there is a distinction between unbelief and true neutrality. True neutrality presupposes abstention, but it does not amount to a stand favoring one view over another. No such inference can be drawn from the state's silence. He also wrote that the preamble, which I mentioned before, the supremacy of God and the rule of law, the preamble cannot lead to an interpretation of freedom of conscience and religion that authorizes the state to conspicuously profess a theistic faith. So this was just wonderful to read. It was a ruling exactly along the lines of this Canadian Secular Alliance had argued for, and these are all wonderful things to have as binding precedent in Canada. And there has been some excellent research conducted in the years since by your neighbors, the BC Humanist Association. They have been calling and tracking every municipality of a certain size in several provinces and recording how many cities are adhering to this ruling and how many are in violation. And there was a surprising number of cities that were not respecting this ruling. But when the BCHA drew their attention to the fact that they were in violation of Supreme Court ruling, many more are now in compliance. So hats off to the very good work of the BCHA on this regard, on this issue. And then a few years later, there was Trinity Western University. Now, I was very heavily involved with this. I'll try not to speak too long about it, though. Trinity Western University is an evangelical Christian university in British Columbia. It's been around for decades. It's a full undergraduate program. It has some professional schools, a teacher's college, nursing school, and so on. But in the early 2010s, they announced that they wanted to open a law school. They got all the necessary approvals from the BC government, and they were set to open their law school. But they had, and for decades, they had a mandatory covenant that everybody associated with TWU had to sign: students, staff, the janitors, faculty, everybody. It's an 8-page. This covenant is an 8-page document that covers a lot of things, but one of the things that is contained in that is that sexual intimacy is forbidden outside of marriage, where marriage is defined as between one man and one woman. This upset the law societies of British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and Ontario to such an extent that they said, look, you can graduate anyone you want, but that requirement is so discriminatory and so awful that we will not allow your graduates to practice law in our provinces. So Trinity Western sued and said, you're not saying that they're not qualified. You don't have any complaints about what we're going to be teaching. You're not saying that they're not going to be good lawyers. So you're just discriminating against us. You have to accept our graduates. And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court. That's probably a longer summary than you needed, but ultimately at the Supreme Court ruled that discrimination, in this case, discriminating against LGBT students, is not a protected religious right. The Secular Alliance argued, and this was actually quoted by one of the justices, that freedom of religion and Section 2 of the Charter is intended to be a shield to protect people from discrimination and cannot be used as a sword to discriminate against others. And that argument was accepted by the Supreme Court. Discrimination is not a religious right. And for the first time, we had in writing that freedom of religion includes freedom from religion, which makes it, in my opinion, an excellent precedent. Another part of the ruling stated that the Charter does not protect measures by which an individual or faith community seeks to impose adherence to their religious beliefs or practices on others who do not share the underlying faith. The minority view stated, so one of the justices that supported the decision, but for their own reasons, wrote that secularism connotes pluralism and respect for diversity. Also stated that secularism guarantees an inclusive public square by neither privileging nor silencing any single view, that the secular state is a neutral state, and they reiterate that state neutrality must prevail. So ultimately, as a result of this decision, Trinity Western decided not to open a law school. And then a few years later, I don't know if this is directly as a result. Oh gosh, I didn't advance the slide. So there you go. I don't know if this is a direct result of the court case or not, but several years later, Trinity Western University made signing that covenant optional for students. And I think that a lot of the publicity from the court case, which hinged, all of which hinged on this covenant, it got a lot of bad press for that covenant, and that's why I think that had a significant factor. That was a significant factor in the university making signing it optional. All right, let's see how much you know about Canadian history. We had a blasphemy law. Section 296 of the Criminal Code stated that everyone who publishes a blasphemous libel is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years. I want to include this because we don't always have to go to the courts to effect change. I'll give you a little bit of additional, I'll give you a couple more clues. The last conviction of under this law was back in 1927, so nearly a century ago, and it was most recently invoked in 1979 in an attempt to censor Monty Python's Life of Brian. So, given that it had been decades since the law was actually invoked and nearly a century since anyone had been convicted of it, why do I celebrate the fact that this law has been repealed? And there's a couple of reasons. One is a moral, philosophical reason. For philosophical reason, I mean, if you happen to be a believer, isn't saying that God needs protection from mortal institutions itself blasphemous? I mean, this is God, right? God doesn't need humans to protect him, her, it, them, whatever. Uh, and to imply that God is so fragile that blasphemy is actually going to hurt him is itself, I think, blasphemous. If you happen to be a non-believer, and I imagine that in a group called Rocky Mountain Atheists, that's going to be pretty much everyone here. I mean, blasphemy is the ultimate victimless crime. There's also some moral reasons that to object to that, to object to a blasphemy law here in Canada. Uh, Immigrants are very aware of our laws. They want to be law abiding, particularly because while they're applying to become a citizen, um, they need to know what the laws are in order to adhere to them. Immigrants to Canada are often fleeing repressive regimes, and so they would feel very uncomfortable criticizing anything religion, knowing that we have a blasphemy law. So it is very effective in suppressing speech. Also, other countries used Canada as a moral shield for their blasphemy laws. So a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, would point to Canada and say, hey, you think it's a crime for blasphemy. You will send people to jail for up to 2 years. We, Saudi Arabia, are also a sovereign country. We also think it's a criminal offense. Now, in our case, we think it's a capital offense, but that's just a difference in the two countries. We are at heart, we are agreed. And I'm very glad that countries like Saudi Arabia can't point to us anymore um, uh, and use us as a moral shield. And also, if a law is on the books, as we are tragically seeing again with our neighbors to the south, it can be used at any time. Just because it hasn't been used in a few decades doesn't mean that it can't be used tomorrow. So taking it off the books removes a tool from the government for that, so that it can't be used um, at all anymore. And then there's a practical reason. So when um, an Alberta judge was convicting a man of murder, and it was a pretty clear case. It was pretty clear that he was guilty. When he was convicting him, this judge cited a section of the criminal code that the Supreme Court had previously declared to be unconstitutional. So it was null and void, but it was still on the books. So in response to this embarrassment, the Justice Minister of the time announced a review of the criminal code. The Canadian Secular Alliance, the Centre for Inquiry Canada, and Humanist Canada. We met with the senior bureaucrat of the Justice Department who was in charge of this file, and we brought Canada's blasphemy law to his attention, and we said it hasn't been tested in the courts, but it is almost certainly unconstitutional. And so Canada revamped a lot of its criminal code in two stages. One, it just removed everything in the criminal code that the courts had already ruled was in violation of the Constitution. And then about 6 months later, a second bill was introduced that repealed Canada's blasphemy law, as well as um, laws about challenging someone to a duel, about fraudulently pretending to practice witchcraft, about impersonating somebody at a university exam. All these laws that were on the books, they were taken out in an omnibus bill. And then to answer the question at the bottom of the slide, Canada's blasphemy law was formally repealed on December 13th, 2018. And there's still many debates about secularism happening today. I'm going to highlight two of them. One is medical assistance in dying. So this has now been the law of the land for a few years. When it was introduced, the public discourse was all about whether people could have any say in how much they suffer before they die, um, and or should the religious view predominate that man should not play God by murdering people before their time. Uh, now that it's been now that MAID has been legal for a few years, the debate continues, but the focus has shifted. And now public discussions are about the appropriate conditions for MAID eligibility and the proper procedures and timing once someone decides to end our life. So are the eligibility criteria for MAID too restrictive? And if they are, that has the effect that we're excluding people who should have this option? Or are we expanding these conditions too quickly? And we're using MAID kind of as an expediency to just get rid of individuals that are too expensive or too inconvenient to support living a life with dignity. These debates continue, and they are important to have. And then, of course, there's also Quebec's Bill 21, which is called the secularism law. I put it in scare quotations because I don't think it is a secular law. It is not an example of government neutrality in matters of religion. So I don't consider it a secular law. And I have to say that no other issue has split the humanist community in Canada that I've seen in my almost 20 years of activism like Bill 21 has. Some secular organizations view the restrictions that Bill 21 imposes as unjustifiably repressing religious expression, and they're against the bill. Others wholeheartedly support the bill, thinking that it is long overdue, and if anything, the greatest flaw of the bill is that it doesn't go far enough. When the bill was introduced, there have been the court challenges. The Quebec Court of Appeal ruled 2-1 against a stay in 2019. They wrote in part that the notwithstanding clause dictates that at this stage of the case, the courts must abandon their fate. Women graduates who are willing to work and who, for the sole reason that they wear the veil, by which he meant the hijab, have been denied access to a job for which they hold all the skills. And the Superior Court heard the challenge to the law's validity in 2020, and then the next year it came out with its ruling, which broadly supported the law. And by support, I mean ruled that it was a valid law. And only a couple of provisions, like it doesn't apply to English language schools in Quebec. So a few narrow exceptions. But the people who supported the law weren't happy with the fact that there were a few exceptions, and those who are against the law weren't happy with the fact that most of it was upheld. So it's going up to the Supreme Court. Just in I think it was just last month or earlier this year, anyway. The Supreme Court of Canada has said that they are going to hear the case. So it's going to go before the Supreme Court probably later this year, and then a ruling will come out about the ultimate legality of the secularism of Quebec's Bill 21, probably sometime in 2026. And lots of debate about that law continues as a result. Now, but I just want to highlight right now the progress that we have made. So in 1939, at the start of the Holocaust, there were Jews that were fleeing Europe and for their survival. And in June 1939, there was a boat containing more than 900 Jewish refugees that were fleeing Nazi Germany. They were denied entry in Cuba, in the United States, and in Canada. And they forced this ocean liner to go back to Europe. The Jews disembarked, and although the records are scant, pretty much most historians believe that most, if not all, of these 900 Jews were ultimately captured and killed by the Nazis. Canada's policy regarding the Jews during the Holocaust was none is too many. Over the course of the entirety of the Second World War, Canada let in almost very few Jewish refugees, about 5,000 over the from 1933 to 1945, which was the worst in the world for countries accepting refugees. You might remember the Syrian civil war, with millions of people displaced internally and fleeing the country. And our Prime Minister at the time, Trudeau, welcomed people into Canada. and over 60,000 Syrian refugees over the course of about 6 years came to Canada. And then Ukrainian refugees in the last 3 years, just shy of 250,000 people have come since 2022. And so our attitudes have distinctly changed in this country. But as always, there is more work to be done. I like this quotation from George Orwell. I'd like to start at religion. That's where the money is. L. Ron Hubbard followed this advice, and he founded Scientology, explicitly so. And Scientology is a recognized religion in the United States, although not in Canada. But Canada still does provide preferential treatment to religious organizations, and of those, they are overwhelmingly Christian ones. So probably the largest single example is the Catholic school systems I mentioned earlier in 3 provinces still remain publicly funded. In Ontario alone, that amounts to roughly a $10 billion subsidy to the Catholic Church. And that's a subsidy not available to Presbyterians or Jews or Lutherans or Muslims or Baptists or Hindus or Mormons or Anglicans or Buddhists. And it's not neutral. Ontario passed a law that stated that Catholic schools had to accept gay-straight alliances where the students wanted it. And for years, the various Catholic school systems in Ontario forbade them from forming. There's lots of other examples. Advancement of religion is a charitable purpose. So that means that if your organization does nothing but evangelize, you are considered a religion. You are considered a charity with all of the benefits that entails. And I want to be clear: if you are a religious organization and you run a soup kitchen, or you teach an English as a second language class to Canadian immigrants, you're clothing people that need it, then you're conducting charitable works. And the fact that you're a religious organization means nothing to me. You deserve to be a charity. But if all you're doing is trying to convince people to adopt your faith, I think that is entirely legal. I support freedom of expression, but it's not charitable, and it shouldn't be recognized as such. There's the housing tax deduction for the clergy. Houses of worship are exempt from property taxes. So the Center for Inquiry Canada a few years ago wrote a series of reports that documented all of these costs, and they are substantial. There's over 30,000 registered charities that exist primarily to advance religion. They've amassed over $38 billion in wealth over the years. All told, with all of this, religion is subsidized by over $5 billion each and every year. That's like $3 billion in tax receipts for religious charities, $1 billion in direct subsidies and transfers, $500 million in income tax and GST, HST credits, $870 million from the property tax exemption. So it's a lot of money that we're talking about, not just in principle, but hard cash. And as I've mentioned, we do have God explicitly mentioned in the Charter and our national anthem, and those are symbolically important. But ultimately, what I want is my work as a secular activist to become obsolete and unnecessary. I think secularism should be boring, not the exciting and dynamic field of endeavor that it is today. When it's working properly, it should be invisible, right? When you turn on the tap and you get water, if everything's working fine, you don't think about it. For those of you in Calgary, you might remember last year, water was short and people had to think about it a lot. But the only reason people were thinking about taking a shower, taking a bath, watering their lawns, having a drink was because there was a major problem. But when everything is working well, you don't think twice about it. You flip the switch, the light goes on. I think government neutrality in matters of religion is something that everybody should selfishly support. because secularism is the compromise position that ensures maximal freedom for all. If it's applied consistently, secularism prevents discrimination against members of a particular faith. It prevents favoritism towards members of a specific sect to the detriment of others. And it prevents the treating of non-believers differently than believers. It's essentially an argument for fairness. So I'm going to end with the two pillars of secularism, and one is the legal and institutional, and that's what I consider like the wholesale. These are the laws and the regulations, the rules, both explicit, written down, and implicit, that govern the country. And the other is cultural, and this is how people think religion and government should interact, and they kind of need to move together. All right. If one gets too far out of sync, if one leads the other by too much, it leads to a backlash and backsliding and regression. So I think I'll give just one example. When it comes to equal marriage in Canada, this is now, of course, the law of the land and has been for about a decade and a half. But this was preceded by decades of grassroots activism that was with the explicit goal of lessening the societal taboo on homosexual relationships. And this was done day to day. This was done through gay pride marches. This is like Be Out and Proud. This was done through media with sympathetic gay characters and TV shows and movies. But something that you might not know is that the first same-sex marriage in Canada owes its existence to the principle of freedom of religion. The first same-sex marriage took place in a church because you could get married through the traditional means, but there was another way, sort of inherited, that was still on the books, called a reading of the banns, which is a religious ceremony that basically says, okay, these people are married unless somebody gives us a reason not to. That's kind of where that phrase should, if anyone objects to this, speak now or forever hold your peace. The origin of that is from the reading of the banns. And so the reading of the banns was done to marry two men. It was essentially a loophole. And then, of course, there was this ultimately led to 8 provincial court decisions in Canada, starting back in 2003, legally recognizing same-sex marriages before the federal law did so a couple of years later. Now, at the time, when Canada as a nation was debating, when the federal government was debating whether it should allow same-sex marriages, Canadians were evenly divided. Every poll had within the margin of error. But you fast forward a decade and a half later, and over 80% of Canadians now favor equal marriage. So this is a case where, at one point the culture led, and then the institutions and the laws caught up and then exceeded where public opinion went, and then public opinion caught up to where the reality is today. So the two are now in harmony. And that's how you get lasting change, is when the cultural and legal institutional changes happen in concert. So thank you very much. If you want more, you can write this down. The Centre for Inquiry Canada is on the web and on Blue Sky. Centre for Inquiry.ca. The secularalliance.ca, we've got a lot of position papers there. We'll probably be, we're going to request to be an intervener for the Bill 21 case that's coming up at the Supreme Court later this year. And if for whatever reason you want to hear more of the sound of my voice, for the past 3 years, I've been the host of Podcast for Inquiry. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts in audio format. We're also on YouTube. Go to the Centre for Inquiry Canada's YouTube page and click on podcasts, and then all of our 85 episodes are available in video form. I also have a blog where I've written a number of essays About half of them are on religious or secular topics. At opinions and questions, I've got a lot of opinions and questions and a lot of questionable opinions. I'm also on Blue Sky, just my surname, Rosenblood at bluesky.social. I don't post there very often, but I do read a lot there. So with that, thank you all for your attention, and I will be happy to take any questions or answers. And I'm going to stop sharing now as soon as I can figure out how to do that. Stop share. There we go. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. So we already
All right.
Some people asking questions. Mike, please go ahead.
Okay, let me see. Hold on, let me get this microphone. So Leslie, you said in your presentation that or implied, and correct me if I didn't understand, but I think you said that Roe v. Wade was overturned because of religion. But in the ruling, the Supreme Court ruling, they did not cite religion as a basis for overturning Roe v. Wade, even though I agree that it was, but I think we have to be careful and make sure that we say it wasn't explicitly done.
No, so the rationale that they did incorporate was that one of the arguments was that life begins at conception.
Okay, that was in the text of the ruling.
It's that one, yeah, part of it, yes. And so
Okay.
they don't say the Catholic Church says
Right, exactly.
that life begins at conception, but they do say, but they do take that Catholic premise, which is not scientifically supported, and I can't say that was the sole argument. That wasn't everything in the ruling, but it was an important part of the justification. So that is why I say that it was it played a non-trivial role. This religious belief played a non-trivial role in the ruling, among other factors.
Yeah, among other factors, and I wish they were more explicit about that. But just like you said, the Establishment Clause in the United States would call into question whether they could do that explicitly. So they did. At least that's what I think happened. I think most of us will agree. I think I'm the only American here, so I am to the South. But I thought it was funny hearing you, because those of us Americans who are Northerners, we think of the South as like Mississippi, Alabama, because those of us in the North are the ones closer to Canada. We tend to be progressive. We tend to have the same values that Canada does. So that's why you see a lot of us now, we're becoming big fans of Canada. I think you've noticed, if you've been online now, a lot of us have Canadian flags, and we're liking the Canada Facebook groups, and we're like, okay, we're going to buy Canadian. So it's good to be here. It's good to be among good company.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Clyde. Stephen, I see you've.
Hello, Leslie. Thanks for a very interesting, lively presentation. And actually, I am a descendant of a Chinese railway workers. My great-granduncle actually worked and built the Canadian Pacific Railway between 1881 and 1885 out at the Fraser Canyon out in BC. And there was a lot of interesting stories there, because he was actually a contractor. He provided the food, so he was like a caterer. And one of the stories that came down from the family was they haul along a 5 feet diameter wok with almost a shovel to cook the rice for the crew. So that was part of the history. There's actually questions I want to ask you about the Trinity Western University, because most of the universities in Canada are provincially funded. We don't have a lot of private university. Like in the US, they do have Catholic university like DePaul, the University of Notre Dame, or St. Louis U. Those are all Catholic university private. Is
Yes.
Trinity Western private?
It is. It gets some. It gets some government funding. So it, but overall, it's a private university recognized by the BC government. So if you get a degree from Trinity Western University, it's a valid university degree, but it's a private evangelical Christian university.
Okay, so they are not really having like the other universities that are publicly funded. They are not. We don't have like publicly funded church-denominated university here in Canada.
Yeah, it gets depending on the year, it gets between 2 and 10% of its overall revenues from the government. So it's not it doesn't get zero government funding, but overall the amount of funds it gets from the government is fairly small.
Okay. And yeah, you mentioned about Quebec. There's something interesting about Quebec. I used to live in Toronto, and I went up to Montreal quite often because I work for Canadian Pacific myself, and went up to
runs in the
Windsor
family.
Station. Windsor Station in Montreal, the head office. I went there quite often. Every time we went up to Quebec, and the railway lines run along this Lawrence River. Notice a lot of the towns in Quebec start with Saint. Saint Hubert, Saint Germain, they all started with Saint. So you can see the influence of the Catholic Church in Quebec is actually very strong and very deep-rooted. And I remember way back then, in fact, in Quebec, you don't need a birth certificate to get a Canadian passport. All you need is a baptismal certificate from the priest.
Yeah. So that's again that's true historically, not true today. Quebec kind of went from being the most religious province in Canada to one of the least. I mean, I think it's kind of a toss-up between Quebec and British Columbia. And if you want to read more about it, read about the Quiet Revolution. So the Duplessis orphans that I mentioned, that scandal really rocked Quebec society and drove a lot of people away from the Catholic Church. But until that point, the government of Quebec and the Catholic Church were very deeply intertwined. Like there was in many respects there wasn't much of a difference between the church and the government. So that is not true today, but it was historically.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Stephen. Brent, nice to see you again. And he's gone.
Yeah, so I assume next available. So good segue from Stephen's question about the Catholic environment. So I honestly have to say I'm not understanding why there's still Catholic public schools. I understood that it was built into the Constitution, I think, but I may have that wrong. Could you give like a 1-minute summary of your understanding of how the Catholic public school system still exists and where it came from? And
yeah, I'll try and keep this brief. There's a lot of history here, and I know probably too much of it. But basically, in Ontario, and other provinces, Catholics were a discriminated against minority, and Catholic parents didn't want to come into Confederation, or Catholics weren't going to sign on to Confederation, and Catholic parents weren't going to send their children to the Protestant schools. The school system, the public school system, as it was called, was really the Protestant school system. So in order to bring them in throughout the country, the British North America Act allowed for the funding of a separate school system for Catholics. In Quebec, Catholics were the majority and Protestants were a discriminated against minority. So there was a similar wording that the separate school system for Protestants would be funded by the provincial government. Now, Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador passed a constitutional amendment that basically said, yeah, this obligation or this option to fund separate school systems doesn't apply to us. And then that was ratified by the federal government. Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador now only have a single publicly funded school system. The other provinces still do it. Whether they have to or not, it's kind of open to question. I certainly have strong opinions on that, but that's untested, so I'll just leave that to the side. But basically, politicians fear that touching the Catholic school system will lose them votes. I can tell about a 3-minute story if you would like to hear it, but you gave me a 1-minute timeline, so I'm just going to stop there unless you want to hear a story.
I'm good to hear it. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I want to tell you a story about a man named John Tory. Now, you might know John Tory as the former mayor of Toronto who resigned in disgrace. Talking about the same man, but not when he was mayor. Once upon a time, John Tory was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. And there was an election called, and Dalton McGuinty, who was then the premier of Ontario in the Liberal Party, called an election, and the polls were neck and neck. It was really a toss-up. It was really unclear who was going to win that election. And John Tory, on the third day of the campaign, of the election campaign, said Ontario's school system, having a separate school system for one faith, is inherently discriminatory. There is no rational justification why adherents of a single religion gets full public funding for a school system throughout from kindergarten through to high school, and that's not available to any other faith. And that will not continue under a John Tory administration. I'm like, this is great. But then he continued. So when I am elected premier, he said, I will extend full funding to every religion in the province of Ontario where numbers warrant. And I have never seen such a complete act of political self-immolation as I did. He handed the election to Dalton McGuinty with that one statement. The very next day, the popularity of the Progressive Conservatives of Ontario plunged, and without basically anything else happening on the campaign, the Liberals won a stonking majority. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is that the lesson that Ontario politicians drew from this experience is that you do not fuck with the Catholic school system. I think it's the wrong lesson. I think Ontarians would be quite open to not funding the Catholic school system and having a single secular school system for all Ontarians. But Ontario politicians are terrified to touch it as a result of that, because he from very solid premises, John Tory leapt to exactly the wrong conclusion.
So in summary, then, do I understand, even though it was written into the BNA Act, which I think is the Canadian Constitution, it's a provincial instituted or administered, and therefore that's why it's at the provincial level where there is a separate school system, the Catholic school system.
That's right. Education is a provincial responsibility, so it's done on a provincial basis. And the terms of the British North America Act, as regards to separate schools, do not apply to those provinces that were not part of Canada at the time of Confederation.
Did not apply to Alberta, because
right,
Alberta became a province in 1905.
Right. So Alberta's justification for funding Catholic schools is different than Ontario.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Do we
Are
have
there any other questions?
no?
All right. Well, thank you for giving me 75 minutes of your time on a Wednesday night.
Yeah, so I'm just posting here the same information that Leslie has already put, and I'll add these to the video description. And just to introduce you the subject of next webinar, we'll have next month David Miles talking about the influenza from the Spanish lady Benwences sniffle. And this one will be similar to the one we had in January, where we will have the recording separate from the broadcast. So we will have the recording on April 16th at noon, and then we'll broadcast on April 23rd at 7 p.m. Of course, on April 23rd, there will be no Q&A. So if you want to ask questions to our speaker, just be on April 16th at noon, and we'll have the regular session. Everybody can ask questions and everything, and then we'll broadcast it on April 23rd. Leslie, thank you very much. It was actually it was better than I expected because I didn't know much about the subject. Congratulations. And I hope to
Thank
see
you
you
all.
in the next webinar. Please, you're already invited.
Wonderful. Well, I'm hoping to come to the WeCanReason conference. I don't know yet whether I'll be able to make it, but I'm hoping I will. And if you're looking for a speaker, you can invite me to come next year.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you
And
very
good
much.
night.
Everybody, have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
Good night. Good night,
Have a
then.
good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night, all.